This
My
conference
name
will
is,
now be recorded.
Sorry, can
my
you
name
start,
is,
Katie?
okay.
Sorry.
Welcome. everybody. My name is Katie Gorka. I am the director of the Fulner Institute's Center for Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. We are so pleased to be partnering with NCFCA. We are very supportive of the great work you all are doing, and we see this as a long-term relationship. We really want to continue to support what you're doing. There's nothing more important than supporting scholarship amongst young women, young people. So we're very happy to be working with you. I'm really excited for tonight's program. We've got some great experts who are going to be speaking tonight. And let me now turn it over to Kim Cromer, the Executive Director of NCFCA.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We are very excited to be partnering again with the Heritage Foundation. You all have been so generous with your time, with your scholarly knowledge, and sharing with our young people. As you mentioned, it is so important, especially now, that we really educate our young people on what it really means to be an American, and especially as we dig into policy topics tonight. It's important for our young people to hear about the topics that our scholars have really poured their careers into. So we're so honored to have three wonderful scholars with us tonight. So NCFCA debaters and coaches and parents, you are in for a treat. I would like to remind you that the chat function for tonight's webinar is for questions only for your scholars. It's not for your general conversation. I know you all miss one another greatly. This is one of the weeks that we would have been together for our regional championships. But for tonight, let's keep our questions in the chat box for our scholars and really glean as much as we can from them during our time together. A reminder, as Catherine told you, it will be recorded, and that recording will be accessible within 24 hours. We'll have it, we'll share it with you, we'll send it out by email. You all will be in listen-only mode so that you can submit those questions. If you want to name yourself with your, not only your name, but your region, that would be helpful and nice to be able to see where you all are signing in from tonight. And with that, I would love to start by introducing you to Daniel Kochis. Daniel is a senior policy analyst in European affairs in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He specializes in transatlantic security issues, regularly publishing on US policy in Europe, NATO, US-Russia relations, and Arctic issues. Sorry. It's funny how you forget how to work your own phone on a webinar. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back and start over with Daniel. Daniel is a senior policy analyst in European affairs in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He specializes in transatlantic security issues, regularly publishing on US policy in Europe, US-Russia relations, and Arctic issues. Kochis is also a regional author for the Heritage Foundation's annual Index of U.S. Military Strength. He's a frequent contributor to several foreign and domestic outlets, including Al Jazeera English, Fox News, National Public Radio, Wall Street Journal, and Voice of America. Daniel has presented at the Transatlantic Think Tank Conference in Brussels, Belgium, as well as the United States Southern Command, and has provided parliamentary evidence to the United Kingdom House of Lords Select Committee on the Arctic. We'd love to welcome Mr. Daniel Kochis by video tonight.
largely been successful, then you should consider examples of how EU Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Coaches, Senior Europe Analyst at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today, and I commend you on potentially considering the question of whether or not the EU should substantially reform its immigration policy. This is a rich topic for exploration, with a host of avenues from which you could pursue. The first question to consider is whether or not you believe that immigration policy in Europe has or has not been successful. If you believe that it has largely been successful, then you should consider examples of how EU policy specifically has led to a successful immigration policy on the continent. As with any good argument, crafting a reasoning behind your position also requires understanding counter-arguments and having cogent arguments to refute them. The same advice stands for those of you who plan to argue the opposite, that EU immigration policy has, in fact, not been successful. You should have reasons why you believe this, remain cognizant of the counter-arguments in favor of the current policy, as well as consider alternatives. For me, looking at immigration broadly speaking in Europe, I think it's hard to call it a success. Societal frictions are increasing. Immigrants are largely segmented either into self-selecting or otherwise specific communities with myriad issues that include joblessness and crime. Terrorism remains a continued and pervasive challenge across Europe, and this in fact impacts Americans as well. I'm not talking merely about American tourists whenever tourism picks back up again, Europe facing the danger of terror attacks, but also American service members. Just this week, 4 Tajik nationals in Germany were arrested on plans to blow up U.S. Air Force installations and harm U.S. service members. So this remains a very serious threat in Europe and has been driven in large part by migration to the continent, recent migration over the past few decades. A 2018 poll of European countries found that overwhelmingly citizens of these nations want less immigration to their country, not more. And this was true whether the country was a Western European country like France, or whether it was an Eastern European country such as Poland. So the populations that currently live in Europe are interested in less immigration than more. And one has to ask themselves why. And I think a large part of this is that migration policy in Europe has been unsuccessful. So taking this understanding as a foundation, I would suggest that you study a resolution which asks, are nation states key to an effective response to Europe's migration challenges? I believe the answer to Europe's immigration challenges is less European Union, not more, but more nation states and more nation state sovereignty as an antidote to the challenges which are being faced by the migration between member states, which is another avenue for discussion that you can have. But assuming we're talking about immigration from third-party nationals to Europe, each member state has its own rules and regulations governing the admission of third-party nationals. But the EU as well is also competent to lay down the conditions governing entry into and legal residence in a member state, including for the purposes of family reunification. So think about US education policy. This is largely a competency of individual states, but the federal government also has some competency to try to inform certain guidelines, which they do via withholding funds and promulgating regulations in order to shape that education policy in the direction that they would like to see it go. Now, the EU has therefore passed laws and regulations regarding the conditions for immigration by certain classifications of third-party nationals, but not for all types of third-party immigration. Now, when you take those regulations, those laws, and you implement them, the implementation of those EU laws and regulations varies widely across the EU. Many member states of the EU have passed legislation on their own at a nation-state level, which has eased entry or incentivized certain types of third-party NASH countries to seek work. So when you had the recent migrant crisis, which continues to a certain degree even today, most of the people coming to Europe were economic migrants. There were some legitimate asylum seekers, but many people were economic migrants. Individual nation states have the competency on their own to determine how many of these economic migrants they want to come to their country. Do they want it to be 5 people? Do they want it to be 500,000? And that's a very important point, I think, when you're thinking about EU immigration policy broadly. This remains a determination that EU member states can make on their own. But of course, at the height of the immigration crisis in 2015, this was largely taken out of their hands as member states were faced with really a deluge of migrants coming to their countries, and in many cases far above the numbers that they would have liked to have seen. But people were just showing up in their countries, and they had to sort of deal with that challenge and continue really to do so to this very day. Now, the EU, part of their competency in this is also the requirement to prevent and reduce irregular immigration, as well as to conclude agreements with third countries for readmission to their country of origin or provenance of third-party nationals who do not fulfill or no longer fulfill the conditions for entry into or present countries for readmission of their nationals. So somebody comes in from Libya or Afghanistan, they apply for asylum in Italy, they get turned down. They're being repatriated back to their country. That is a competency of the European Union. And in some cases, they have concluded agreements, but in many cases, they have not. And then, of course, you have the question of, there are people within the EU, within Europe, who have applied for asylum, been rejected, gone through legal challenges, lost those legal challenges, but still have not been repatriated because there's concerns about their treatment when they return home. So they're stuck in this sort of legal limbo, which is an interesting, I think, avenue for potential consideration for you. Now, there's also the question of immigration and assimilation of immigrants. This is a competency of individual member states, and as such differs widely across the EU. Furthermore, the question of what constitutes citizenship is not, immigrants to Germany, say Turkish immigrants who've been there decades since just following World War II, who are still not German citizens. They're still Turks. And so this is, I think, part of the challenge that Europe faces is their conception of citizenship is very different, largely, broadly speaking, than the American conception. This is not true in every nation. Some nations, such as the UK, take a more sort of American approach towards citizenship, but it's something that you should be aware of, and it's potentially one avenue for future debate and consideration. Now, as I mentioned before, immigration to the EU has been a hot topic since 2015, when a surge of migrants come into Europe, some genuine asylum seekers, but many, however, economic migrants overwhelm social services and asylum offices across the European Union, and expose the EU's utter inability to control the external borders of the EU and to prevent or reduce irregular migration, which, as we discussed just a little while ago, is one of their competencies. Now, what happened? Therefore, nation states, I think, really took up the mantle of preventing and reducing immigration. And we see this even today. You have Italy, for instance, is very active, working with the provisional Libyan government to reduce migration, not just from Libya, but more importantly, for people who've transited from sub-Saharan Africa trying to get to Europe. Many of those, of course, who unfortunately are perishing at sea on their journey. And so the Italian government really has taken steps to work and sort of are members of the Schengen zone, although many are. Now, the Schengen area has eliminated most border controls for participating countries, and it's eased the flow of goods and persons. So for many of you who may have traveled to Europe, when you fly into Paris, you could very easily travel to passport control or have a new visa. And this is thanks to the Schengen zone, but this also presents quite a few problems, as you might imagine. It greatly exacerbated, for instance, the migration crisis in 2015. People were arriving in a country, say like Greece, and they could travel onward 3-4 countries ahead to the country where they were seeking to land, really. And so what happened was that many Schengen members temporarily reimposed border controls. They can't permanently reimpose border controls because they're members of the Schengen zone and they're in place to stop them from doing so, but you can temporarily reimpose these controls under certain conditions, which many did. And so these controls have, you know, in many cases, even today, been reimposed because of the coronavirus pandemic. So you see this sort of question about Schengen, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, sort of rearing its head once again. And this also plays into the question of intra-European Union migration. So, you know, you say in the UK, we had the question, part of the people who were coming and working as servers, say, there was this question of whether or not they're taking jobs from native Britons. This wasn't the main driving force behind Brexit, but it was one of the factors. So that's sort of one question, I think, if you are thinking about intra-European Union migration. Now, a further point I think that should be mentioned is the EU law in the form of the Dublin Regulation. And so the Dublin Regulation requires that any third name in the first EU member state that they enter. So in 2015, this regulation was in many cases either ignored by officials in European border states, Italy, Greece, or by asylum seekers themselves who continued on from those border states towards places like Germany and Sweden, which there's either a social network in place or perceived as having a larger welfare state or benefit structure for them. And they wanted to get to those countries. In 2015 alone, for instance, over 1 million third-party nationals were via land through Turkey, or more importantly, overseas. And we're not landing, of course, directly in Germany, but we're still reaching Germany and claiming asylum because the Dublin regulations were not being followed. In subsequent years, because of this, the EU tried and failed to distribute asylum seekers from places like Germany and Sweden, but also from some of these border countries, even today, that have large populations of migrants arriving, to places specifically in Eastern Europe. And so the EU member states, particularly in Eastern Europe, really pushed back against this. They said that we, as sovereign nation states, want to have control and do have control over who we have come into our country. If we have too many people entering our nation who don't follow aren't familiar with our laws, our customs, do we somehow lose our culture? And this is, I think, a debate which continues to this very day. This question of, is there a certain point where this question of assimilation and the inability of many European countries to assimilate their migrants in the same way that the United States is able to. But I think that this is a really important avenue for discussion and one that's going to continue really for the next few decades to be a very hot topic in Europe. So I think, many of these EU member states really saw these quota programs proposed by the EU as an affront to their sovereignty. And so they fought against these EU efforts to enforce this quota system, and these efforts have largely been dropped. So they've been abandoned. They could be resurrected sometime in the future by the European Union, but for the time being, I think that there probably is a significant immigration problem, both in terms of continued third-party migration. The main points of entry have shifted. So these points of entry have shifted, say, from the Central Med around Italy to places like Spain, the Western Med. And then, of course, you also have sort of a reheating up of migration patterns coming from Turkey, as Turkey has reneged upon an agreement with the European Union to limit migration through their country because of anger over Europe's assistance to Turkey in their military actions in Syria. And so you also have this question of what to do with migrants who remain in refugee camps in many southern European countries, and there are many of them. They're stuck in this legal limbo. They're not happy about it, the countries of origin. Don't want them repatriated, and the countries that they landed largely don't know what to do with them and don't want them settling there. So this is, I think, really a question that has yet to be resolved. And then there's, of course, the question, as we've discussed, is the failure to which continues to remain a challenge really across Europe. What is clear is that the current immigration policy and system in Europe is broken. The open borders orthodoxy, which reigned in the EU capitals, many EU capitals in 2015, has been wholly discredited. Ultimately, securing a nation's borders has fallen to the nation states themselves. They've taken on this competency from the EU because of the EU's inability to patrol borders and reduce irregular migration. And many European countries have decided on their own to invest in border security. Flow of migrants at their source. This will save lives and help reduce many of these challenges we've discussed today. The EU should continue to try to conclude repatriation agreements with third-party nations whose citizens' asylum claims have been declined. But the EU should permanently abandon plans for a migrant quota system which impinge upon the sovereignty of member states, and instead commit to the principle that individual nation states know best how many immigrants to allow into the nation and what forms of assimilation work best for their particular circumstances. I wish you all the best of luck in your debate, in your research.
We'd like to say thank you to Daniel for his wonderful information on the topic of the European Union and immigration. I know what he shared with us already has given us a number of topics to think about before the families vote this week for next season's resolution. So with that, I would like to invite Mr. Joshua Meservey to the platform tonight so that he can share with us on the resolution resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase humanitarian assistance to one or more countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Mr. Meservey is a senior policy analyst for Africa and the Middle East at the Heritage Foundation. He specializes in African geopolitics, counterterrorism, and refugee policy. From 2006 to 2009, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia and extended his service to work for the U.S. Centers for Disease and Prevention. In 2009, he joined Church World Service based out of Nairobi, Kenya, and traveled extensively in East and Southern Africa, interviewing refugees. In 2012, he worked at the U.S. Army Special Operations and helped write an Army concept paper. In 2014, he joined the Atlantic Council's Africa Center before joining the Heritage Foundation. He's testified twice before the Senate and 3 times before the House of Representatives. He's a lead author of a monolith on al-Shabaab's insurgency and contributed a chapter to the book War and Peace in Somalia. He has written pieces for a wide range of publications, and his commentary is often featured in various print and digital media outlets. He's presented at the National Defense University and the State Department. So, Joshua, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. It's really a pleasure to speak to everybody, particularly on a topic that I find personally really interesting. I'm going to keep my remarks brief as possible because usually for me, the more interesting parts of these discussions are the Q&A session. So I want to try to leave as much time as possible. So just very briefly, I'm going to present what is probably best described as the aid skeptic view on this question, on this resolution that you're considering. Now, as Daniel said very rightly, of course, you have to consider both sides of this question, the pro and the con. But I'm going to take more of the con side just because that is a perspective that's probably less represented in mainstream sources. So hopefully this will be of greater use for the audience. So to answer this question of whether the U.S. government should substantially increase humanitarian aid to a sub-Saharan African country, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of the humanitarian aid? What is the United States trying to accomplish in this scenario? And I think I start my analysis with the fundamental premise that anything the United States government does, including dispersing humanitarian aid overseas, should ultimately redound to the benefit of American citizens. American policymakers are duty bound to hold this as a priority in all their foreign policy dealings. So in light of that premise, there's three ways I think that dispersing humanitarian aid can actually be of benefit to the United States. One, unsurprisingly, is that it can help shore up an ally, it can help support an ally country that is potentially struggling with some sort of crisis or profound poverty. It also can build influence with countries that the United States is interested in having influence with, so potentially a strategically located country, a country that has significant natural resources, something like that, where a good working relationship is important to American national interests. But when people ask this question or discuss this topic, usually what they're talking about is humanitarian aid designed to alleviate poverty in a poverty-stricken country. That's generally what this topic centers on. And that I would suggest that alleviating poverty is absolutely consonant with American national interests. That is a proper use of American humanitarian aid. The challenge comes when you look at the record of humanitarian development assistance overseas. And it's very poor, frankly. It has not moved the needle at all on poverty, actually. There's been some successes in the public health sphere, which are very welcome, that saved many lives. But when you're talking about poverty reduction, humanitarian aid has not worked. In fact, it's failed. No one knows the numbers for sure around how much money has been sent overseas, both from the United States and many other development assistant countries, but it could be $1 trillion or more over the decades. But the reality of that is that, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, profound poverty remains at essentially the same levels that they did when development aid was first being dispersed. There are also many unfortunate examples of humanitarian development assistance actually having a counterproductive effect in certain countries or in certain situations. So in Somalia, famously in the 90s, when the United States and the rest of the world was responding to the famines there, the contributing countries rushed in with free food, which is a perfectly natural response to a famine, of course. The issue there is that they wiped out the local merchant class that was selling food and wounded what the frail economy even further within Somalia. So there needs to be much smarter disbursement of humanitarian aid, was one of the great lessons from the Somali famine response. So there's that issue. There's also the issue of fueling corruption, where in certain situations, currently I think South Sudan falls into this category, unfortunately, the primary prize for which elites usually are fighting is the humanitarian assistance itself, and all of the lucre that's associated with these flows of food, but also money. So they can actually, humanitarian aid can actually serve as an accelerant to conflict. So those are just two of the pitfalls that have beset humanitarian aid for decades now. So if the purpose of American overseas development assistance is to alleviate poverty, then it needs to be redone. It needs to be rethought. And fundamentally, that development assistance should focus on, except in rare circumstances where perhaps there's a crisis that needs to immediately be addressed with just, again, food aid or something of that nature. But long-term development assistance should focus on building free markets, essentially, in sub-Saharan African countries. Free markets are the only proven method of poverty alleviation in history. It's also the most dignity affirming way for people to raise themselves out of poverty. So there's much to recommend that approach rather than this continuing this failed approach that has lasted for decades now of contributing humanitarian assistance in ways that, again, can fuel conflict, that can fuel e-competition for the aid itself, that can distort local markets, and that can form real dependency and even entitlement in receiving countries. It can really distort the social contract where government elites are actually more responsive to international donors than to their own people. So focusing aid on developing free enterprise systems as a way to avoid some of those pitfalls still needs to be administered, obviously, carefully and wisely and strategically. My personal analysis is that is the best way forward. I spoke quick, I threw a lot in there, but I want to leave it there because, again, I think I already see some questions coming in. I think Q&A is most interesting. I'm happy in Q&A to discuss the more aid positive side of this resolution if that's of interest, but otherwise I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Joshua. Africa is a topic that NCFCA hasn't considered in a few years, and I can tell just based on the questions that we're getting in the chat that they are excited for the opportunity to dig into the issues that you suggested there. And so we'll come back to those questions. So debaters, please be sure to add those in to the chat function. Remember, our chat function is for questions to our panelists tonight. So our remaining resolution that we want to hear about before we get to the Q&A is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its development assistance to one or more of the following: Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Tonight's presenter is Ms. Ana Quintana. Ana Quintana leads the Heritage Foundation's efforts on U.S. Latin policy or U.S. policy towards Latin America. She's authored numerous policy studies included, but not limited to, Cuba, Venezuela, and Central America. In addition to writing policy papers, Quintana's articles have appeared in Real Clear World, The National Interest, The Federalist, among others. Her work has been cited in media venues such as the Washington Post, Bloomberg Business, The Guardian, and the Wall Street Journal. And she's been a commentator on media outlets like Fox News, MSNBC, and Al Jazeera. She's also testified before the U.S. Congress. Prior to joining Heritage, she was a student trainee at the Defense Intelligence Agency. She also held internships at Virginia-based International Relief and Development, where she worked on the rule of law issues in Latin America, and at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where she worked on civilian-military cooperation. I'd like to welcome tonight to our webinar, Ms. Ana Quintana.
Thanks, Kim. And hi, guys. You know, it's unfortunate we're not doing this in person, but I guess this is the new reality for the time being. It's funny how I'm going to continue on with a bit of the aid skeptic train that we're on, but I guess let's just be consistent. And so, you know, I think it's often believed that the conditions within El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and I think I'm going to lump the three together because often the three are referred together as Central America's northern triangle as the subregion. And typically when policies are prescribed, it's prescribed to all three, right? So it's typically believed that, you know, the conditions are going to be improved by by a marked increase or significant increase of development assistance. And I personally disagree with that point. And I think this point continues to come up now, especially in light of the Central American migration crisis, right, at the US's southern border. And while definitely it's in the US's interest to address the border crisis and the certain challenges that are occurring in these countries, foreign assistance and increasing development assistance, it's really not a solution. It's not the silver bullet solution that sometimes, you know, you hear these pundits on TV talking about. And, you know, to give some context to the region, right? So these three countries are essentially only emerged from civil wars in the late 1990s. And I think this point is important because it often gets lost in the conversation that these are incredibly nascent democracies run by governments that are essentially, their governments are largely run by the same warring factions that fought each other during the Civil War. So imagine 30 years later, right, 30 years before, they were killing each other, and now they're expected to coexist and run governments together. And so this has produced this political instability and this poor governance, which has clearly had an impact on development, right? So each of these countries suffers from widespread poverty and a lack of economic opportunities. And these challenges, they're not just fixed by an influx of foreign assistance, right? You can't fix problems of governance and intersocietal conflict with aid. If anything, frankly, you make it worse. You reinforce, it's kind of to that point of what Josh was saying, you make corrupt elite stronger. And so you have these powerfully entrenched interests, right, that have dominated key industries for generations, and they've concentrated power in the hands of monopolies. And opportunity for advancement, it's really not built into the operating systems of these countries. And this isn't something that's just easily or readily changed with well-meaning development assistance. And so I think another challenge, irrespective of what the US is doing, that irrespective of the United States, that I think another thing that doesn't really get enough attention is that these governments are not spending enough of their own money in terms of social services for their own people. And so while the majority of their citizens live in poverty, if you look at what they spend in terms of social services per capita, it's some of the lowest in all of Latin America. Yet if you look at the amount of money that's embezzled from public ministries, I mean, it's literally in the hundreds of millions, right? In Honduras, not even just one official, but this group of government officials stole $300 million from the Social Security Institute back in 2014. And there's various cases that have happened since 2014, right? But that was $300 million, 2014. From that, the president's brother was arrested as he attempted to launder a portion of those funds in the United States. The same year that occurred, the United States spent $82 million in Honduras in development and insecurity assistance. 3 of Guatemala's last 4 presidents are either in a prison right now or were arrested for corruption and embezzlement, essentially stealing from their country. This is another, in El Salvador, I mean, the same trend is like a regional, it's a common thing. 2 former presidents of El Salvador, same issue, right? One is in hiding in Nicaragua after he and his family stole $6 million from the government when he was in office. And one of their former presidents, Tony Saca, made $13 million in unreported income while he was president. Had no ability to trace back to a single receipt, a single book he wrote, I mean, any way to demonstrate that he legitimately made that money. And so I think, corruption by the region's public and private sector, it's really the heaviest development impediment here. And in this space, it shouldn't be the US working alone to fix this, because I think often we have this idea that it's America's responsibility to be the leader on this, but Mexico shares much of the challenges of what's occurring in the Northern Triangle, because remember, Mexico and Guatemala share about a 600-mile-long border. And whenever the subregion is destabilized, it directly impacts Mexico. And often, we've been hearing about these policies that Mexico has been implementing, getting a bit tougher on immigration. It's not so much because the United States is forcing Mexico to do this. It's because it's becoming a heavy cost on the Mexican government. If you look at polls within Mexico, there's a higher percentage of Mexicans that support stronger border security enforcement efforts than in the United States. At last count, I think it was about 64% of Mexicans support their National Guard surge, their National Guard deployment to their southern border with Guatemala. Right, and so Mexico recently promised this multi-billion-dollar aid package, and they've even walked it back because they know that it's not going to be government assistance that's going to get these regions out of their dire economic straits. It's going to be it's going to be economic freedom. It's going to be diminishing these trade barriers and making it so there's this making it so there's opportunity for everybody in these countries, and it's not just determined by what political class you are, what political party you belong to, or what family you're a member of, but that every average person actually has the opportunity to succeed. And I think in kind of to close things out a bit, the U.S. can and should be engaged in these countries, and I'm not advocating for U.S. disengagement. I think, if you look at what's happening, right, they're the top growing source of illegal immigration to the United States. It's also a key transshipment point for northern bound drugs coming from South America. But our engagement needs to be calibrated with our national interests and what we're actually able to accomplish. And often the United States is faced with governments that are either lacking in capability or political will to frankly address their problems. I mean, recently the United States thought that the president of Honduras was a great partner, and what it turns out is that the president of Honduras, the current sitting president of Honduras, accepted money from a known drug trafficker. And right now the president of Honduras' brother is sitting inside of a US prison for shipping cocaine to the United States. So even when you think that you have a political ally to cooperate with, to actually address shared challenges with, it really doesn't exist. So this whole idea of development assistance, of channeling money through governments, that if that's your channel, if that's your filter, your impact is going to be so minimal. And I think so the key challenge really isn't a lack of funds or a lack of engagement, but like finding ways of elevating our standard for cooperation, finding ways for these countries' private sectors to encourage their governments to make it so that everybody can prosper. And I think these things aren't just going to be changed with a surplus of US assistance. And, guys, I really look forward to your questions. I'm seeing that there's a few of them coming in, so I'm glad we still have time and I didn't ramble on too long. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Anna. Very much like Africa, Latin America is a topic that we haven't done in a while. So our students, you can tell they're excited to know more, to dig in, and that they're already forming opinions about that. So I know that we want to go ahead and go over to our questions. So I'd like to invite Anna and Josh back onto the screen with me, so we can get started with those.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. All right, let's start with one question for Anna. I know you're probably just catching your breath again, but the language of this resolution is currently humanitarian assistance. So
Sure.
Is the difference between humanitarian assistance and humanitarian development assistance?
I see that this is where I think I don't necessarily think so, right? So I think all US assistance needs to be calibrated with US interests, right? So because remember, Congress is beholden to the US taxpayer. Every bit of money that Congress gives, it's essentially our money. So when we think of humanitarian assistance, our humanitarian assistance, like I think it's what Josh was talking about earlier, it's thought of as food assistance, things like that that are given in disaster scenarios. That's not necessarily the assistance that's being given in Central America. It doesn't necessarily work that way. It's not like we're going down there with bags of beans and coffee and things like that, because again, you displace the local economies and you essentially steal business from the local markets. So that's not really what the US is doing. The US doesn't necessarily give so much in terms of humanitarian assistance. It's more in development assistance.
Okay, great. That's a wonderful clarification for our families. Josh, one for you. Could a plan to privatize humanitarian aid by the US, giving money to private charities, kind of the opposite of the public route, would those people in turn use it to help the countries in sub-Saharan Africa? Do you see that as a viable option?
Well, actually, most humanitarian aid that goes to sub-Saharan Africa flows from private organizations already. So it's about 3 times the amount that the US government gives. So which says something wonderful about our country, actually, that private philanthropy is such a strong ethic here in the United States. Private non-governmental organizations, NGOs, have struggled with many of the same problems that U.S. government official assistance does. So they have been a central part of humanitarian development assistance, overseas development assistance, and humanitarian disaster relief responses for decades. But they have not been able to move the needle either on poverty rates in Africa. They do great work in certain contexts. Again, disaster relief, where you just have to feed starving people, for instance, or deliver medical supplies, things of that nature. But as far as long-term development aid, private enterprises, unfortunately, have not been any more successful than the U.S. government attempts. And a lot of money that the U.S. government sends to sub-Saharan Africa for development assistance is already filtered through private organizations.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Anna, back to you kind of on that free market option. What kind of development options do you see with the free market that would be compatible with Northern Triangle cultures?
Well, I mean, for what kinds of, can you repeat that question again?
Sure. What kinds of free market development options would be compatible with Northern Triangle cultures?
Sure. So I think we need to separate free market and development, because inherently U.S. foreign assistance is inherently anti-free market. I think the point where we can actually make some real successes is with U.S. private sector engaging with their respective private sectors, right? And there's already these great relationships that are occurring. I mean, the Guatemalan private sector is very active in the United States, and they're trying to find ways of looking, how can they reduce barriers that they have, right? Like, I mean, there's just, so we have a free trade agreement with Central America. It's called CAFTA-DR with the Dominican Republic. But still we have these absurd barriers with textiles and things like that that still exist. You would think a free trade agreement wouldn't have trade barriers, but they still exist. This is a role for the private sector to start engaging the US trade representative and start saying, if you really want to truly wean these countries off of foreign assistance, this is how you create jobs. And also right now that we're in the middle of this global pandemic and that everybody's starting to question the future and kind of recognizing the importance of having so many of our supply chains in China, the Western Hemisphere is probably starting to look a lot more reliable to companies wanting to diversify their supply chains, right? There's already companies that pre-COVID were starting to move supply chains to Mexico. This is only kind of, right? Mexico is a manufacturing, and North America is a manufacturing platform. Why not bring that further south? I mean, but these are things that the private sector can lead on, not governments. Governments are not wise enough, to be honest, to manage our incredibly complex economic systems. Like, this has to be the private sector.
Okay, super helpful. You mentioned COVID-19. Joshua, one of our debaters, wants to know, will the U.S. budget for foreign aid for sub-Saharan Africa, will that be affected because of COVID-19?
It's hard to predict with any certainty, of course. Thus far, no. The answer is no, it has not been affected. The United States has been responding specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa with rerouting or repurposing certain funds to address the pandemic specifically. But as with all budgets, it can change and probably will change. And it really depends on the trajectory of the pandemic here in the United States, I would say, because there may well be domestic political pressure to focus American resources here at home rather than overseas if things get a lot worse here in the U.S. So we have to wait and see, as unsatisfying as an answer as that is. But again, thus far, there has been no effects. I don't think, unless there's an absolute worst case scenario, I think some level of American assistance will continue to flow to sub-Saharan Africa, which actually is the largest beneficiary of humanitarian aid. That's where the U.S. sends most of its overseas development assistance.
Got it. Yes, uncertainty seems to be the only certain thing with COVID-19 right now, doesn't it?
Indeed.
So for both of you, so Anna, why don't you take this one first and then kick it back over to Joshua. In what ways does corruption in the Northern Triangle and the sub-Saharan African countries differ?
In what ways does it differ? Well, I can't speak about corruption in Josh's region, but just, I mean, to the point that I was bringing up about how you had a civil war only 30 years ago in all three of these countries. Imagine a civil war. Imagine if we were in post-Civil War United States and it was literally a wars fought in the jungle with the Soviet Union supporting one side and America trying to support another side. And then all of a sudden, these two sides have to now find a way of coexisting and governing. In the midst of that, they are now becoming the key transshipment point for all the drugs that used to flow through the Caribbean are now going through Central America. All of that is happening essentially at the same time. I mean, it's literally, you cannot create kind of like, it's like if you're creating like the science experiment and throwing all these explosives inside of it. That's literally the situation inside of in these countries in terms of corruption, right? Because that just fuels and breeds corruption, because you have drug funds, you have governments that are completely unaccountable to no one because all they care about is staying in power and keeping the other side out of power. I mean, it's really, it's frankly horrible.
Mm-hmm. Great. Joshua, on corruption?
Yeah, it's much like in Anna's region of study. Corruption in Africa is a cancer. It undermines any attempt at reform of good governance. And so many of the problems in Africa you can trace back to this governance issue, right? I think it was Amartya Sen who wrote a very famous book. He's a development economist. He made the point that there's never been a famine in the modern age in a democracy. And famines are not a result of a lack of food. They are a result of poor governance. And unfortunately, Africa has had any number of famines, even the last 2 decades. Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan is teetering on the brink of a famine sort of perpetually right now. Those are all a direct result of governance and of poor governance. And corruption is a central part of poor governance. The reasons are complex. Some of them are the same as those that Anna mentioned. Some are, a lot of African countries only recently gained their independence, so they're still governed by independence movements. So these were rebel groups that fought in the bush, sometimes for decades, and fought nobly, even you could argue. But eventually, when they came into power, they succumbed to the temptations of power. They felt that they essentially owned the countries because they had fought and bled and died for them. And then you add in tribal dynamics and the need for patronage to fuel those networks that keep you in power, which are usually tribal networks, and it really can be a toxic mix. So fundamentally, that's part of the reason I focus on private sector solutions, because private sector suffers from corruption as well, but it's less centralized, meaning there are fewer options for corruption. And when you're chasing a profit motive, sometimes that can actually be a countervailing force against corruption.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, one more question, Anna, on your side. It's the question of what would your thought be in terms of the United States federal government funneling some of the money that would be a support system through the NGOs, through those charities that you think would be maybe more successful at getting around the drug cartels or whatnot? Is that something that currently happens, or is that something that you would think is a good idea?
Sure. So the US has pretty high standards for the NGOs that they work with, right? And so there's I mean, and that's one thing I will give to them. There's pretty high standards for vetting. There's really high standards for the organizations that they work with in terms of like, because the US government is essentially the donor, then there's the recipient NGO, and they're the ones that are doing kind of like the work, the implementing work on the ground. The problem is on the monitoring and evaluation side. And on the Central America funds, there has literally only been one entire study over the last decade to measure the impact of US foreign assistance to Central America over what's called the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI. And then now when in 2014, when President Obama and Vice President Biden, when they surged up development and security assistance. There was literally only one study in over a decade. Besides that, the majority of the monitoring and evaluation in this process happens by just seeing how much money you appropriate and how much money is spent. That's essentially how we monitor. And so it's not so much a lack of like, do we have reputable NGOs or do we have reputable organizations that we're working with? That's a component of it, but it's about what exactly are we working to achieve, and can we demonstrate that after a decade of X amount in investments towards in this development assistance sector, and also in terms of security assistance, which is another thing that we could spend hours even talking about, like the efficacy of security assistance towards these countries where where police officers are not even going through polygraphs. I mean, that's the thing. There's just so many steps in between and so many kind of like, there's just so many minefields in that. It's really difficult to assess. Yeah, you can have the best actors with the best intentions, but when the context is essentially a hot mess, how effective is it going to be? Right? For lack of a term.
Right. It's probably very descriptive. Okay, Joshua, closing remarks from you.
Sure. First, it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you again for having me. It's the question on humanitarian development assistance to sub-Saharan Africa is a fascinating one. It's hugely complex. Obviously, I didn't at all do it justice in our short time here. There's literally been books written on this, so I think you could study this and use it as a debate prompt with no fears of being bored or running out of source material. And it's a hugely important question because Africa remains desperately impoverished. That's of humanitarian concerns in the United States, but also concerns us for other security and related reasons. So it's something we have to get right. We haven't for 5 or 6 decades. So perhaps by examining this question, you all can come up with the solution and change this situation for the better.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Joshua. Anna, closing remarks?
Sure. I mean, thank you guys for hanging in there with us tonight on a Monday evening to listen about the red-headed stepchildren of foreign policy. Really, nobody's really paying attention to Latin America or Africa. So I'm very encouraged that you guys are actually following these topics. And I highly encourage you guys, even, irrespective of this debate, to continue following these regions. There's a lot of activity happening, and I can promise you there's a lot of opportunities career-wise later on in these regions, because there are not a lot of right-minded people focusing on this. And so I think, often when you're going to be reading about Latin America and just kind of like foreign assistance writ large, you're going to read a lot about people who just say we just need to disengage. And I think we're going to be seeing a bit more of that now in light of the global pandemic, right? That the United States, that this is just a lesson in the world, that the United States was just too engaged abroad and we need to disengage. And that should not be the takeaway. That should not be the lesson. I think rather it should be, how do we calibrate our foreign assistance, whether it's security assistance, development assistance, humanitarian assistance, with our national interests? Because remember, at the end of the day, all this money is our money. It's taxpayer money, and our government officials are accountable to us, and there needs to be some integrity behind this. And so, I mean, there's a lot of information out there on how effective development assistance in Central America has been, where we can actually make where there have been some success stories in terms of like real private sector oriented action. And I mean, I think I really wish you guys the best of luck, and I hope we get to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, Anna, Joshua, and to Daniel for sharing what you do every day, the things that you're so involved in, and the importance of these topics. Our students are better for it. So thank you so much for that. NCFCA, the recording for this evening's webinar will be available within 24 hours. We will send that out to you by email. And I'd also encourage you to visit Heritage website. That's heritage.org/events for more webinars and sessions. Also in the email that you'll get as a follow-up tomorrow is another opportunity that Heritage Foundation is offering for you all to participate in, as well as Thursday night's webinar with 3 more scholars who are going to talk about the value resolutions. So thank you again. We are excited to have spent some time with you tonight. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.